want to welcome you all here today to Christ Church and to our spiritual home. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, we are looking for faith and courage. God of courage, endless source of faith and hope, grant us wisdom and knowledge in the midst of uncertainty. God of hope, creator of all that is seen and unseen, grant us patience and trust in the midst of anxieties. God of love, redeemer of all that is broken, grant us strength and compassion to comfort the afflicted. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, above, below, beneath, and beside us, above all else, help us to fear less, hope more, and live with courage. This we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Well, it's a great joy to welcome you all here today for what I believe is going to go down as one of the most important conversations that we've had. No pressure, Meg. I want to begin with some questions that I want to ask before I introduce Meg Jay. They're questions that she asks in her book, Supernormal, which is what we're here to talk about today. How do we live with the traumatic and adverse circumstances that we've had in our lives? And how do we live with them and process them in a way that doesn't just diminish us, but can actually enlarge us and help us to become supernormal, heroic helpers? I think the journey often begins with questions. As the poet John O'Donohue once wrote, "The question is the lantern." So here's some questions for us to consider. Did you lose a parent or a sibling through death or divorce? Did a parent or sibling often swear at you, put you down, humiliate you, isolate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid? Did you live with a parent or sibling who was a problem drinker or who abused other drugs? Were you ever bullied by or afraid of kids at school or in your neighborhood? Did you live with an adult or sibling who struggled with mental illness or some other serious illness or special need? Are you living these questions now? Of course not us, Meg. We're perfect. We're fine. And we really don't want to talk about this today. So thank you for coming. Thank you so very much for coming.
Then y'all better get going now, I guess, because that's where we're headed.
Meg writes, if you answered yes to one or more of these questions, or if you've lived with an adversity not mentioned just above, you are not the only one. Considered individually, each of these experiences may affect only a small minority of the population, but considered together under the umbrella of childhood adversity, multiple studies in the United States and around the world suggest up to 75% of us have experienced events like these. Meg Jay comes today with a word of courage and a word of hope that these experiences don't need just to diminish us, but they can enlarge us and help us to become super normal. Meg Jay earned a doctorate in clinical psychology and gender studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She earned a degree with high distinction in psychology at the University of Virginia. Wahoo. You're in occupied territory, just so you know.
That's true.
Her work has been appeared in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, Los Angeles, USA Today, Psychology Today, on the BBC, NPR, and in a TED Talk, watched over 10 million times. She's an associate professor of education at the University of Virginia, and she maintains a private practice in Charlottesville. She is a certified clinical trauma professional, as well as a certified child and adolescent trauma professional. Please join me in welcoming to Christ Church, Meg Jay.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we often use the phrase, "Oh my gosh, that was traumatizing."
Yes.
We use that loosely. What do you mean when you say adversity or trauma? What's the definition?
Typically, the definition is when the stressor or the hardship in your life, whatever it is, outweighs or overwhelms your ability to meet it or to cope with it. And I think the interesting thing about how we use trauma is we tend to use it, or adversity, at the two ends of the spectrum, that we know war is trauma, we know being a refugee is trauma, but then we say, oh, I was traumatized when I ran into that old boyfriend. So we use the two ends of the spectrum, but we don't talk enough about the most common adversities in between, some of the ones that you were mentioning, and they're the ones that I talk about in Supernormal. And I made a point of talking about the 10 most common adversities that 75% of us grew up with in one book, because I think often we talk about them in silos, and they're different books for different people, and that makes people feel alone or like different from other people. But if we talk about them together as adversities, then we realize that we're not as alone as we think we are.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about sort of the brain science of adversity. And it's interesting that you say in your book, the brain processes all threats in the same way. A snake, a gun, a drunk parent, a bear, an abuser's truck, the sound of a violent sibling's voice, a mother's menacing scowl. So say something about that, or as far as the brain is concerned, the amygdala, and how we experience that. That's really sort of surprising, because I think we tend to sort of group some of these experiences as sort of higher level threats and lower level threats.
Absolutely, and that goes to what I just said of why I included them all in a book together. You can't compare and rank trauma, because it depends on the specifics of the event and your ability, and your community's ability to help you meet that. And the brain science behind that is that there's not a different part in our brain for this adversity or that trauma. We have one kind of a fear detector, a smoke detector in the brain, the amygdala. And when it senses danger or uncertainty, it doesn't matter which kind, it goes off, stress hormones are released, and they flood our bodies. And we become more vigilant and more fearful, but also more courageous. What's interesting is it also tends to shut down our speech centers, and so we become ready to kind of meet whatever that adversity is, whether it's a mother's menacing scowl or a bear or a snake. The brain is reacting in the same way. It can't differentiate. And so something to understand about the kind of adversities that you mentioned is most of the adversities that young people grow up with, whether it's having an alcoholic parent or bullying in school or living with domestic violence, these are not one-time events. So they're events that trigger our brains every Saturday night or every night or week after week or year after year. And so the impact of having a bear in your house or right outside your door day after day, year after year, that's where these sort of everyday adversities, that's how they build up over time.
So to the unenlightened person who says, just get over it, I mean, we all suffer, and, cry me a river. Do you see my violin? I mean, we hear these things.
That's a mean person.
Yeah, but I think what you point out is there is a shaping that happens to the brain, that we can't just get over it. We're actually changed through the ongoing impact of trauma and stress. Say something about that.
Sure. So our brains and our bodies are affected by this cumulative chronic stress, cumulative trauma, whichever kind of terms you prefer. So people tend to become more vigilant. They may become stronger and more determined because they have a lot to fight back against day after day. So it's, there are ways we become stronger and more courageous, but it's also very stressful to live in that way. And over many months, many years, it can put us at risk as adults for health problems, liver disease, lung disease, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, cancers. But where we're also going to head in this conversation is that can be undone as well through positive experiences. But chronic stress, just like you've probably heard, chronic stress at work isn't good for you. We all understand that. So by the same token, chronic stress at home, especially in a developing body and brain, it's not good for us, and it takes a toll on our health and on our mental health. I think half of mental health problems in adulthood, 2/3 of substance abuse problems, and 2/3 of suicide attempts are associated with childhood and adolescent adversity.
So you've spoken sort of about how suffering as illness sort of can show up later in life. I'd like you to say more about that in terms of how, when you're working with clients, patients, how these, if you will, and I mean this in a non-judgmental way, how dysfunctions can sort of show up with people who have not yet processed the adversities and traumas that they've experienced. I mean, you've even said that oftentimes we don't really process these things, sometimes even ever. So how do they show up in the way that they might, and you see people being actually diminished?
Right. Well, that's usually what brings people to my office, is that they are struggling with some sort of mental health struggle, for lack of a better word, but some depression, anxiety being the most common, relationship problems are very common, substance abuse problems are very common, probably 4 of the most common sequelae of early adversity, early chronic stress. So often people come to my office because as young adults or older adults, they are starting to have problems, or they have been having problems in these areas, and they say, oh, and by the way, I've never told anyone this before, but I grew up with an alcoholic, or I've never told anyone this before, but, or I try not to tell people this, but my parent was in jail. And so usually it's the adult problem that brings people into my office, but that's often when the first conversation is had about, well, I'm not surprised given the way that the first 10 or 20 years went for you. It's understandable that you would feel depressed now. Of course you're feeling anxious. And to help people make that connection. We had a great conversation at dinner last night. One of my favorite quotes is by a writer named Bell Hooks, and that's that education is an intervention. And I really see myself as an educator at heart, and that a lot of people come into my office, they don't know a lot about the problems they grew up with. They know they happened, but they don't know that much about them. They don't know how common they are, that they're not as alone as they think. And they don't know that they often lead to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, relationship problems. Doesn't mean we can't improve those things or get through that, but of course that's the way they're feeling, because that's what 20 years of chronic stress will do to you.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pause for just a minute, because this is a big conversation, and some people didn't actually realize they were going to be here today. So this is a lot to process. So let's process this for just a minute. The things that she's talking about, that my guess is sort of hitting our hearts in lots of different ways as we think about our own lives, as we think about our families, as we think about the places where we live. My guess is that for some of us, our heart is beating a little faster. What I think everyone hopefully heard is that what she's just described is 75% of us. "75% of us in this room have experienced something." And that means, you say, rather than thinking that we're damaged goods, we're normal. Yeah, so how are we normal?
Well, I mean, of course, we don't want to think of that as normal in a healthy sense, but in terms of normal and statistically common. And a lot of the times when people come to my office, it's because something isn't going well in their adult life and they feel that they are different than other people. They have this sense that they're different than other people because of how they grew up, which typically has been kept entirely to themselves or mostly to themselves for a variety of reasons we could talk about. But
I want to talk about that.
and so people come into my office because they're having a hard time, they feel alone, and they feel different. So that they tend to feel very abnormal. And so part of the education as an intervention on my part is to say, actually, what you're describing is an abnormal. Unfortunately, it's quite normal. And by that, I mean it's quite common.
The norm, yeah.
It's unfortunately, statistically, the norm. And so to move people from, I'm abnormal, no one would understand me, to, hey, more people might understand me than I realized. Maybe I could have a friend that I could tell about this. Maybe a partner would want me, and maybe my partner might have their own thing. That's sort of the first part of the work. And then there's the supernormal part we can get to.
And I want to get to that, but say something about, a little more about shame, guilt, and secrets.
There's a lot in Supernormal about, which is the title of the book, about secrets. I think it's really the second or third chapter, because most people, for a variety of reasons, who grow up with the adversities we've been naming, others, we haven't, physical, emotional, sexual abuse. I mentioned having a parent in jail, which, this is interesting. I think 20 years ago, 101 in 132 kids had a parent in jail. Now it's 1 in every 28. It's become so common that they talk about it on Sesame Street now. But typically we grow up and we experience whatever adversity it is that's in our home or in our community. And our brain, remember, when we're afraid, our brain is quiet. That if there's a bear near you, you probably don't go hide in a bush and scream. You hide in a bush and go quiet. And that's often what kids do, that they kind of, dig in and make it through what they're dealing with. And they keep it to themselves, partly because their brain says go quiet, often because their parents or their families or their communities say go quiet. This isn't the kind of thing that we talk to other people about. And so there's often a secret there. And secrets have a way of just in and of themselves feeling bad. There was an interesting study, I can't remember where it was done, but they had a group of young adults take a test. And one group, took the test and told others how they did, and the other group took the test and they said, don't tell anybody how you did. And the people who were told to keep it a secret felt worse about their performance, even though it actually wasn't worse. So my point here being is that secrets have a way of inherently feeling shameful. And doesn't mean you need to write a memoir about everything that's happened in your life, but we know that when people talk to at least one other person about their adversity or about their lived experience, that they feel less shameful about it, that it feels tolerable to themselves and to another person, so therefore couldn't be as bad as we were imagining.
How do you figure out who's safe enough to share your life with?
That's tricky, and that's where I think, we talk a lot about, we live in a culture of confession, sort of, at least on television and social media. But it depends. That we know that when people share their secrets with others who can respond with non-judgmental acceptance, with interest or curiosity or questions rather than judgments or advice too quickly or diminishing of, world's smallest violin, that people feel helped when they share their secrets to other people who are interested and non-judgmental. It's pretty straightforward in terms of what you do when someone shares their secrets. Is less is more. You listen, you're interested, you empathize, and not run away from that experience. But when people share their secrets with others and they get judgmental or, ugh, I wouldn't tell a whole lot of people that story, then they're less likely to share again. It may be a decade before they share again. It's interesting that I work a lot with young adults, some older adults, but most of the young adults in my practice have never shared their adversities until they're in my office. It's not like they haven't remembered them. They've known they were there the whole time. They just didn't know who a safe person to talk to. And oftentimes someone who seems like, well, this is their job to be a safe person, probably like yourself, people often start there.
It's interesting to me how it also shows up in the faith journey, that oftentimes when our parents have been experienced as unsafe, or just life generally, is we project that onto God. God shows up as our angry parents, or God shows up as judgment rather than the God of love and compassion, the Jesus who says, do you want to be made well? And then actually participates in the healing experience with people, that sort of deep incarnational love. And I'm struck that as we sort of move toward the definition of supernormal, we would do well to think about how we perpetuate the lack of healthy community, whether that's in our families, at home, as a church, that sends out this signal that it's not real, that is a projection. Again, the same that we project on God, we project on community. Everything must be perfect here in South Charlotte. Everything must be perfect at Christ Church. You must look absolutely perfect. You must see the communion walk as the communion catwalk, where everything is just perfect. And what a disservice we do when we perpetuate unhealthy places where people, rather than moving toward healing, actually become sicker because of an unhealthy expectation, a lie about what it means to be human, rather than a place, again, of acceptance. So let's move to the definition then. What is supernormal?
The word supernormal means above the normal or average. And I was doing a bunch of research on resilience, kind of the early stuff done in the 70s. And I read that word applied to very resilient kids and teens. It appeared one time in one article, and as soon as I read the word, I said, that's it. That's the title of my book. Because what I experience in my office, which I was sharing earlier, is that people come to me and they feel abnormal because of their adversities, but they don't see that they're actually supernormal because of the resilience. That most of the people in my office who may be struggling with depression or anxiety or substance abuse or relationship problems, meanwhile, it's amazing what they've come from and where they've gotten themselves, but they have some secrets, and those include what they grew up with and what they're still struggling with. So the struggles are a secret. So to help them focus less on the adversity and more on the resilience, to see themselves not as abnormal because of what happened to them, but as supernormal because of what they've managed to do in spite of it, because of it, and what they're still doing. I mean, they're in my office to say, I need to fight back against this too. I need to be courageous with this also. And what I really loved about the word, we don't have there are copies of the book outside, but there's a cape on the front of the cover. And in the book, I use a superheroic metaphor. And what I loved about the word supernormal is it hints at the courage, at how much strength and courage it takes to be resilient. That my problem with the word resilient in our culture is that we think of it as bouncing back. So sometimes people will come to my office and they'll say, so-and-so knows something about my life, and they say, gosh, you really bounced back. Mm-hmm. And they go, that was nothing like what it was like. Mm-hmm. Or we think of it in terms of grit, which is one part of the story, of the courageous story. But to me, it's really about courage, about taking a leap of faith to imagine that you could grow up and create a safer home than the one you had, or be a better parent than the one that you had, or have a better marriage than the one you saw, or create a healthier community than the one that you knew. To me, that's not bouncing back. It's not even grit. It's courage. It's a real leap of faith.
So I want to get to that because there's so much you've said about the healing power of love and what we can do. But I want to go back to that first moment when someone comes into your office and says, I've had this on my chest forever, and they share it, or maybe you share something with a friend or the like. I know it's a non-linear journey, but what's the journey from feeling this heaviness and this anxiety and shame to coming to a place where those things are probably always there in your memory? As you say, the past is never entirely the past, right? But what does the journey look like to go from being sort of debilitated by trauma and adversity to being in that place of supernormal where you're aware of it and yet you're pushing through it and using it as a way to love other people?
Well, I'll say, when you said, what's the journey from that moment when someone comes into your office and says, I've never said this before, I don't really talk about this. And what I was experiencing when you said that is how I feel when people say that, is my first thought is, your healing has just begun. I'm so relieved when someone comes into my office and says something like that, because I think this is fantastic, because I know that's the beginning of better. Now, again, most of these people are already quite maybe successful in the world, at work or in school, but I know that in terms of healing brains, bodies, relationships, it tends to begin with, I've got to tell another person this.
Is there an age that you find that this begins to sort of show up? You talk about in the book how in the early years it's experienced. A person maybe separates, gets away in their 20s and gets busy in college and et cetera. And all of a sudden, maybe in their 30s, when they're beginning to live out some things that they experienced as a child, they're now experiencing as an adult, as a parent or whatever, sometimes as a professional. Sometimes these things all of a sudden appear out of nowhere.
Right. So it really varies, because it just really depends on when that first opening is seen. That as therapists, I sometimes think about clients. Sometimes clients will come in and I can tell they're tossing breadcrumbs to see if I say the right or wrong thing, to see if I'm going to be the person that they're going to go a little further with. So sometimes you'll hear about an adversity for the first time in elementary school or middle school or high school, college, could be anything, but you're right in that they never leave us, and that we revisit, we re-meet them often in big milestones in our lives, when we become parents, when we become partners, when there's a trauma in our community, that, they're always a part of us. But, you talked about the journey of, it often starts with this, I've been living with this, how do I live with this? And at our dinner last night, Chip and Matt and I were talking, and Matt said, I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, that he's a pusher, not a puller, and that he, rather than wanting to pull people close and heal them that way, he wants to help them out into the world. And for me as a therapist, that could not be more true for me, that I think some therapists want that person to feel healed by coming to see them. Mm-hmm. That's the end of the story. But for me, the journey starts with maybe starts with them talking to me. But if that's the end of it, then I have failed. that I want next there to be a friend, I want there to be a mentor, I want there to be teachers, I want there to be partners, I want there to be volunteer work, or however it fits for that person, to take that experience that's been a secret and integrate it into their lives. It doesn't mean it has to be part of everything that you do, but that you figure out, how do I make this a part of who I am in a way that makes me feel more courageous and stronger, and like I have something to offer because of it, not that I am damaged because of it.
So sometimes just naming it and realizing the role that it's playing in influencing that self-awareness is part of the healing journey. If I'm aware that voice is still there, I can begin to have a dialogue with that voice, maybe even silence that voice to some degree, and also listen to how it might be inviting me to love other people, to have compassion for other people. I guess what I'm struck by here is that we're in this room with many people who have access to to care, although I have to say that it's a huge struggle to get to a place where often for people to say, I need help, and then to actually get them help. As you know, we have a real crisis around access to care and getting into therapists and insurance, et cetera. But I think we would do well for a moment to reflect on people in our community who are profoundly under-resourced, who experience multiple traumas, maybe even every day, the material poor. I don't like to collapse net worth into self-worth, so the material poor. What would you say to those of us who might be inclined to say, poor people just need to work harder. They just need to get a job. They just need to, how does the experience of trauma fit into all of that?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if anybody has seen, that's a big topic of conversation in Charlottesville right now, and in a lot of places in the country. But to say poor people need to work harder is an oversimplification, obviously. And what we know, not just about trauma and how trauma it sets people up for, substance abuse, mental health issues, physical health issues, et cetera. There's also intergenerational trauma. So for a lot of the people in my community in Charlottesville that are struggling, they're second, third, fourth, fifth generation families where their ACE scores, the number of adversities they grew up with, it wasn't 1, it was 8.
So let me interrupt you. Would you please say what ACE is?
Sure.
What the test is, and say more about that, because I think this is really helpful.
Absolutely, and this is very Googleable for people who want to know more about this later. But in the last 20 years or so, researchers, psychologists, medical doctors have studied the adverse childhood experiences, so the 10 most common adversities, most of which we've already named. So from alcoholism in the family, domestic violence, the ones we've been talking about. And the higher your ACE score, the more you are at risk for these health problems. Because remember, I talked about any one of these adversities is already cumulative. Having a parent who's addicted to drugs is not a problem for one day. It's a problem day after day, year after year. And then on top of that, we know that adversities often cluster or snowball, because if you've got alcoholism in the home, you've probably got some domestic violence in the home. You might have some emotional abuse in the home. And so we know that of the people who are exposed to one adversity, 80% are likely to be exposed to a second. So actually to just have one adversity is somewhat unusual. And 50% of people who grow up with one adversity are actually exposed to 3 or more by the time they're 20, because they tend to snowball. So you can go online, you can Google ACE score or ACE quiz, and there's a quiz that you started to read basically the beginning of it at the start of our talk, and you can see what your ACE score is. The higher the score, the more the cumulative trauma and stress. So probably the bigger tax is on the brain and the body. And that puts you at risk for more health problems, mental health problems, substance abuse problems. It doesn't mean you're doomed, and we're going to get to that. However, to undo some of that, there have to be healing experiences, and so not enough communities have those available. So it's just generation after generation of trauma after trauma.
Well, I want to turn to the healing, but I think a big part of courage is awareness. And so I think we have to plumb the depths of this, and we certainly haven't plumbed the depths of this, but to have awareness and consciousness, whether we're dealing with something in our own lives, in our families, whether we're helping a child at Raymond Road Elementary School, whether we're thinking about how to support a larger community, how helpful it is to understand the sort of psychobiology of trauma and the journey of healing, and how important that is not to oversimplify it. And I think it's interesting that, that you've made the point that people are in a lot of different places. Not everybody needs a therapist.
Right, and not everyone can get one.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a friend, and sometimes it's a community where we experience the undoing of the trauma. So that's really what I want to talk about now. So I have to say, as we talk about the healing piece of this, I love this so much as a pastor, as a healer, and as one who's been through things in my own life. I was joking with her that I wanted to read some things to her. And I was joking about, this is going to feel like a Saturday Night Live skit. Because there's a moment where, I don't know if you remember, Chris Farley interviews Paul McCartney. And do you remember this scene? And he goes, do you remember that time, like when you were in the Beatles and you sang that song? And he goes, yeah. And he's like, that was awesome. Yeah. So this is awesome. And I just
would be
want to.
fine with me if we did that this morning.
Yeah.
That works.
So I want to just read this because it's just so beautiful. We are the sum of all the moments in our lives, all that is ours and in them. By now in this conversation, it should be clear that repetitive negative moments can impact our hearts and minds, and for the same reasons, repetitive positive moments can too. Just as stressful experiences that trigger the amygdala can boost our stress hormones and tax our brains and bodies, soothing experiences with loved ones have the opposite effect. Love does not just calm our brains, it changes them. Say something about that. How love can change our brains.
Well, and it's really what you were just referencing, and I think it's really important that for people to know. Not enough people know about the ACEs and the ACE scores and the impact that has on your brain and your body. However, we have gotten better at educating people about that, and it can seem a little bit scary or daunting of, well, I'm done for. Look at what I grew up with. I'm going to be sick. I'm going to die early. I'm going to have mental health problems. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so if you think about it, it may sound corny that love heals or love cures, and I have a PhD in clinical psychology. So anything I say has to be backed up with science. But the same way that being overexposed to our stress hormones, it poisons our bodies and makes us sick. Reducing our stress hormones makes us well. So we know that having positive relationships in our lives, and it does not have to be romantic love or having a partner or whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. Like the brain doesn't differentiate between a bear and a snake and an angry parent. It doesn't differentiate between love from a reverend or a friend or a therapist or a partner. It feels healing, it feels soothing. It decreases our stress hormones, and it undoes the physical impact of trauma. And so, I mean, there's a scientific underpinning to what we've sort of always known for all the generations, that love heals, that relationships heal. And so that's why when people come to my office, I'm so happy that they've come to start a relationship that can be positive, that can be healing. And I want to increase that, the quality and the number of those relationships, however I can. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship. I just want there to be more good ones in a person's life, because that's actually what disrupts that relationship between the ACE scores and your health. It doesn't mean that you're doomed, but it does mean that you're going to have to find sources of healing in your life or you're at risk.
Well, you use the word reboot, and I love that we can experience a reboot, and that families can experience a reboot, that communities can experience, for all of us who are thinking about like all the damage that we've done, like this morning, getting your kids to church or something like that, or, whatever else. There's a sense in which the hope, right, is that we can reboot. So say something about the reboot.
I have to first laugh out loud that that's one of the funniest stories in my family, was that my grandfather, there were 4 kids in the generation above me, that he would be shouting, "Get up, we got to go to church, get your clothes on," and the kids always said they never could figure that out, but it was quite a thing to get out the door on a Sunday morning. But so yes, the reboot, that's what I see when someone comes to my office, and I think this is it. This is the beginning. This is the beginning of your healing. This is the start of your reboot. And one of the most difficult or important misunderstandings that people who grow up with adversity have are, I'm different, I'm damaged, no one will ever want me. If I didn't have a good parent, I can't be a good parent. If I didn't see a good marriage, I can't have a good marriage. It's not true. And yes, it's true that there is intergenerational trauma, and there is a cycle of violence or a cycle of alcoholism or a cycle of whatever it is in some families, but it's actually not even in most families, and that it is possible for you to do it differently, for you to do it better, for you to have a better life as an adult than you had as a kid. And this is an enormous shift, an enormous leap of faith for someone in my office. It's not like they've never heard that thought before, but the idea that they would really trust what I'm saying, that that's possible for them, and entrust it enough to go have a child. And imagine that their child might have it better than they did. That's an enormous leap of faith. It takes a lot of courage.
Well, you speak also about becoming heroic helpers. And I think one of the things that the gospel speaks of so powerfully is the power of redemption. That part of being supernormal and of rebooting is the redemptive quality of when we can take our empathy and be courageous in love. And in the book, you quote Henry Nouwen: "The great illusion of leadership is to think that man or woman can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there. Supernormals have been there indeed. They have found their way out of the desert that was mental illness or bullying or alcoholism or abuse, and many have become effective, impassioned, heroic helpers, not in spite of their backgrounds, but because of them." And then you quote Carl Jung: "The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected." But, you say, too many supernormals have a crisis of confidence, and they ask themselves, who am I to take on this work? When rather the question is, who better than I to take on the work? So as we think about the journey that we're on as supernormals, 75% of us in the room, what would you invite us to think about as we walk out here today? What are some practices that we can engage in? What invitation or challenge would you give us that we might maybe look at ourselves in a new way and live in a way where maybe we can experience greater resilience, greater love and compassion, that we might not only be freed up to experience joy, but actually help others. What would you invite us to do, to think about?
You know, I think one of the favorite sets of studies that I looked at when I was writing Supernormal is, it goes back to, it's the people. I'm thinking of that Mr. Rogers quote of, that I think that his mother said, you know, anytime there's something in a community, a tragedy, a trauma, a fire, whatever it is, always look for the helpers. There are always people helping. And if you look at, there are so many meta-studies, which are hundreds of studies, thousands of participants. Typically, the single biggest predictor for how people fare down the line after adversity, there are several, there's not just one road to adversity, but one of the biggest, most reliable ones is not how severe the event was, but how alone the person felt during or after. And that goes back to an adversity is when stress overwhelms coping or stress overwhelms supports. And so if you look at the studies of, okay, so when people didn't feel alone, who was there? I have to admit, therapists were rarely mentioned. That actually it's the teacher, it's the aunt, it's the sibling, it's the neighbor. You know, that what's really amazing about Supernormals, about resilient people, is that they're scrappers. They're scrappers in the sense is that they're getting out there and they're fighting for a better lives for themselves. But they're also scrappers in that they're able to take bits and pieces of good from other people and let those moments add up. And so I think sometimes we think, well, if I really want to help someone, I have to take that person into my home, or I have to, you know, have some grand gesture to make a difference. Otherwise, what am I really doing? But actually, most resilient people, most supernormals would say, you know, it was that one year I had this one teacher, or it was that one conversation I had with this neighbor this one time, or it was that one friend I used to stay at their house a lot. And so I guess my point here is to not underestimate how you may be a heroic helper for the 75% of people in your life, your kids, their friends, your neighbors, whatever, and they don't have to be grand gestures. That resilient people are piecing all those positive moments together, and they're making a difference. It doesn't have to become your life's work to change the life of another person.
I cannot thank you enough for coming to talk to us today about what's arguably some of the most important things in our lives, in our histories, in our present, and in our community. And what I hope is that we can walk out here today with an awareness that the very things that have been broken, that have often led us to feel shameful and guilty, can be the very things that, through love, can transform us and make us not perfect, but stronger, so that we can be freed up a bit more, haunted a bit less, and more courageous in the way that we are invited by God to be helpers. Because by being helpers, we become healers. And that's what I pray for this community, for everybody here today, and for all the people that you come in contact with, that you'll go with a new consciousness and a new hopefulness. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.